Welcome, everyone. We're just getting set up, still not even 7 o'clock. My name is Jay Becker, and I'm going to be the moderator this evening. At the risk of having to repeat this later, this is a webinar sponsored by the Chicago chapter of Refuse Fascism. And here's our speaker, Paul Street. But people are just getting on now, so it's not even 7 o'clock.
I haven't looked at the cable news in the last 15 minutes. Maybe everything I'm going to say is obsolete because of some horrific event.
Oh, well, I don't think we're in danger of peace breaking out. Yeah, so by way of introduction, Paul Street is an independent progressive policy researcher, award-winning journalist, historian, and speaker. He is the author of 9 books, most recently Hollow Resistance, Obama, Trump, and the Politics of Appeasement, and this book. This was new a few months ago. This happened here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America, published by Routledge. So as it says, it's the Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. Blow by blow what we went through and why. And most directly in terms of this webinar, Paul is also a member of the National Editorial Board of Refuse Fascism and has spoken on our live streams and written for Refuse Fascism website any number of times. So I think we can say that we're coming from that perspective, and yet we're also going to be expressing our own opinions tonight. And we'll try to make that clear. But Refuse Fascism is a broad movement that came together after Trump was elected, because we recognized that was Trump and Pence represented a fascist agenda, and that we were only going to be able to stop them by a mass, nonviolent, persistent movement, which we were not successful in mounting. And we remain committed to analyzing and standing against and sounding the alarm about fascism. And if you notice my green scarf, that is a symbol of that we take in solidarity from feminist movements and people of Latin America who have stood up and waged that kind of battle for abortion rights. Because there's a war at home here too. That is the war on women's basic humanity and our right to control our destiny, to determine if and when we're going to have children. And Refuse Fascism is endorsed and participating in a new movement, Rise Up for Abortion Rights. As the name says, we are not only in solidarity with, but taking important, vital lessons from the women of Latin America. I encourage everyone to please go to Rise Up 4 abortionrights.org and join this. Refuse Fascism from its inception has analyzed a triad of the fascist program in the United States: violent reassertion of expansion of white supremacy, violent patriarchy, and anti-immigrant chauvinism, national chauvinism. And right now, the battering ram of that program is abortion, state after state after state. And Rise Up for Abortion Rights was the only national movement that called people into the streets on International Women's Day. It was a powerful, beautiful launch, and it needs to grow dramatically immediately. So again, that's the green scarf. We invite you to be part of that as well. And if you aren't, if you don't get the Refuse Fascism, if you're not signed up, I really urge you to go to refusefascism.org. get our emails, subscribe to the podcast. You'll hear lots of, it's a great conversation every week about what's happening, analysis and what needs to be done. So it's just a few minutes. It's actually still just a few minutes after 7. Just for etiquette here, you're going to be able to see Paul and myself. Everyone should be able to see and comment in the chats. We have two, if you look down at the lineup of symbols at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a chat function, and you can post your comments there. But if you have a question, I really please put it in the Q&A. You'll see it's like about in the, they're both more or less in the middle of the lineup of symbols down there. Please put your questions in Q&A. That's where I will be looking for them. I can't guarantee that I can follow the chat that much to see everything that's over there. And if I see at least one person has their hand up, Marcia, if you'll put your question in the chat, if it's in general, if it's a question for Paul, then just write it in the question point. Yeah. Yes, I can see you, Lisa. I mean, I can see your question. So I think that's our, you are in the meeting. It's, okay, for Marcia asks, she doesn't see the other participants because this is a webinar. The only people who you're going to see are the host, that's me in Zoom talk, I'm the moderator, and our speaker, who is Paul Street. So you won't see the other participants. You can see them in the chat. Like we can see there's Marcia Rannon writing a question in the chat. So you can see each other in the chat, but not this allows us to have way more people on the event. So that's the point. And I think that's everything. So yeah, questions in the Q&A, feel free to chat. Feel free to comment in the chat. So there we go. Paul, do you want to start your presentation?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was a little confused about that myself. So I was looking for these pictures and I thought we had nobody here. So we do have people here, and that's wonderful. Thank you all. I see 37 attendees here. Greetings from Chicago. This is the home of the Haymarket Martyrs. It's the home of the great revolutionary Marxist Fred Hampton. It's also the home of the May 2012 mass demonstrations, which I'll never forget, against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its long global war of terror. That was again in May of 2012 by my recollection. If I was to give this talk a title, I would give it a line from Bob Dylan's song, All Along the Watchtower. Let us not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. This is the gravest existential moment of potential nuclear conflict that I've lived through, at least consciously. I was a nursery schooler during the Cuban Missile Crisis. My parents did not update me on the geopolitics of October 1962. My mission tonight, I think, is to cut through some of the propaganda on all sides of the Ukraine crisis. I've got a button on right here that says, don't think like American, don't think like an American, think about humanity. But I suppose I could update that button for tonight and say, don't think like an American, don't think like a Russian, don't think like a Ukrainian, think about humanity. What I want to do is start with a set of principles. I've got 4 core principles I want to set out by way of introduction. Then I want to go very briefly through what I think are 7 of the worst false narratives about the Ukraine crisis that are coming out of the Russian side and the so-called pro-Russian side. And then I want to go through a roughly equivalent number of the, which I think are more urgent for us, given where we are. I want to go through 7 or 8 of the biggest false narratives on the US/Western/NATO side of the Ukraine crisis. And if I have some time left after that, then I want to go into what I want to come out of this, and what is to be done. So let me get into some of these principles. Principle 1, there's no social justice, there's no democracy, there's no civil liberties, there's no voting rights on a dead planet. That's true whether the planet is frozen in nuclear winter, or whether if the planet is being cooked to death in a climate meltdown, hot or cold. There's no social justice on a dead planet. Let's be clear about something. A no-fly zone or NATO jets in Ukraine equals a military confrontation between the United States and Russia. A confrontation between the United States and Russia equals World War III. World War III has a very strong potential of being a terminal nuclear exchange. There's also the climate angle. Notice that fossil capital, fossil fuel interests are exploiting the Ukraine crisis to make dangerous arguments for the acceleration of the pace of the mass extraction and burning of fossil fuels, which is part of the what I call the project for the greenhouse gassing, for turning the planet Earth into a greenhouse gas chamber, which is actually literally a crime beyond anything Hitler ever imagined. I hate to be so scary and frightening and chilling, but these are very serious times. Let us not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. That's principle 1. There's no social justice or democracy on a dead planet. Principle 2, we can chew gum and we can walk at the same time. We can and must oppose more than one thing simultaneously. In this instance, we can oppose both US imperialism, NATO imperialism, which is basically US imperialism, because let's be honest, NATO is the United States. And we can also oppose Russian imperialism at the same time. We don't call them identical or say that they are equivalent, because there's never been anything in history on the scale of the American empire, which accounts for more than 1/3 of global military spending and maintains more than 1,000 military installations across more than 80 countries. Still, we align with neither Washington nor Moscow. We do not fall for the Pavlovian fake left habit of thinking that the enemy of our enemy is always our friend. Well, you know, the enemy of our enemy is sometimes our friend when it's Che Guevara or Mao or Lenin or the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, but it's not when the enemy of our enemy is Hitler or Mussolini or Hirohito or Vladimir Putin. We do not wrongly embrace mass murderous, fascist Kremlin aggression because we rightly oppose Washington's imperialism. That's principle 2. You can really, believe it or not, can hate or oppose two things at the same time. Principle 3, reject white and imperial hypocrisy. For many of us on the anti-imperial left, it's been painful, depressing to watch the American political and media class fall over itself with moral outrage so strong that they seem ready to skirt with World War III in response to terrible things being done in Ukraine. Again and again, we are told that America stands up to bullies, and that's why we must do everything we can to help Zelensky and white-skinned people of Ukraine. Meanwhile, there are significantly greater ongoing human tragedies being inflicted by US allied client states, Israel and Saudi Arabia, against brown-skinned people in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Yemen, and elsewhere. Is Uncle Sam standing up to these bullies? Of course not. Don't like bullies? America, look in the mirror. U.S. economic assistance boycott right now is killing thousands, if not 10,000s in Afghanistan as we speak. Russia has yet to commit crimes remotely close to the ones the U.S. itself has directly committed against non-white people in Southeast Asia, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, with a cumulative body count reaching well into the multiple millions. Our media and political class still refuse to acknowledge those ethnic crimes as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And there's a skin color to this selectivity of concern and to this Chomskyan division between who counts as worthy victims and who doesn't count as worthy victims. Fourth principle, anti-fascism begins at home. There's a lot of loose talk in the Ukraine crisis about fascism. Both sides are calling the other one fascist. I actually think it's more accurate to describe the Russian regime right now than the Ukrainian government as fascist. And if you want to know why, you can ask me in the Q&A. It's an interesting and it's an important question. My main point here, though, is that we've got plenty of it right here in the USA, where one of our major parties, the Republicans, has gone essentially white nationalist fascist. And the other one functions largely as its Weimar-like enabler. Revolutionary communist theoretician Bob Avakian has said, Americans, your shining city on a hill is full of fascists. I just wrote a book about it. It's called This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. And by the way, if anybody had told me about a month ago that I would be having a webinar, I would have thought it would be about that book. But of course, the chaos of international imperialism has changed that thoroughly. Anyway, those are my four principles. We can review them later if anyone wants to. Beware the fog of war. When I say fog of war, and I said it was my mission to try and cut through it today, I mean a couple of things. The first and the most obvious and commonplace sense in which the phrase fog of war is understood is that every side in a war creates narratives to support their side. They want to win people over to their side, so they construct storylines that fit their agenda. There's another meaning, I guess, of fog of war that means that things start moving very quickly and become very anarchic and unpredictable, and there's sort of chaos, and it's hard to keep track of them. That's certainly true too. I just realized that that's another meaning. And then I think there's a third meaning of the fog of war, which is that during war, during international conflicts, and particularly during wars, there's a kind of cover that comes over societies where people get so distracted by what's happening outside their borders, or maybe along their borders, sometimes inside their borders, that we lose sight of the wars that are being taken place against the people in the countries. The wars at home, the war on people of color, the war on immigrants, the war on gay and transgendered people, the war on women, the war on civil and voting rights, the war on truth, the war on history, the war on the teaching of accurate history in this country, last but not least, the war on livable ecology. A lot of these things tend to go under the radar screen. Police shootings tend to go under the radar screen. Attacks on civil rights tend to go under the radar screen as everybody becomes focused on the great military conflict. But anyway, that's my little riff on the multiple meanings of the phrase fog of war. Let me get back to that first one, though, to cut through the BS on all the propaganda and all the false narratives that get out there. Let's try and cut through the fog of the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war. I don't have time here to take down in detail all the Russian lies and the Russian spin. So I'm just going to list them, and folks can ask me in the Q&A for elaboration. I count 6, is it 6? Yes, I count about 6 big Russian lies, many of which have been just almost slavishly taken up by and repeated by what I call the Pavlovian fake enemy of my enemy is my friend, fake left. 1, Putin had no alternative but to invade, false. 2, images of Russia bombing civilian targets are fake news. Not true, it's false. 3, Ukraine isn't a country. Wrong. 4, Ukraine is a Nazi state and Russia's invasion is a repeat of the great patriotic Soviet war against fascism during World War II. False. 5, Ukraine is committing genocide against Russian speakers. 6, all the imperialism in this conflict is on NATO's side, which is incidentally America's side, because NATO is the United States by and large. Russia is an imperialist. It's just practicing national self-defense. All of this is complete BS. You want more on that? Ask me. I'd get too far behind if I went into all the details on that, because I think the more important lies for us, given where we are in the belly of the beast of the greatest empire the world has ever seen, are the most significant ones that we are most morally that we have the greatest moral duty to question. These are the false narratives that it is our greatest responsibility to critique, the ones on the Western/US/NATO side. And I count 8 core Western US NATO false talk narratives. Let us not talk falsely now. False Western narrative number 1. NATO is just a defensive European alliance. Bullshit. NATO is an extension and arm of US power. It is the American eagle to the Russian bear in Europe. NATO has fought offensive wars beyond Europe in Afghanistan and Libya. And it trains and it coordinates for actions far beyond Europe and indeed around the world. False narrative 2, which I'm actually going to return to because it's the toughest one and the one that we have the most, have to do the most detailed digging into, the most intellectual work on, but I'll state it now anyway. False Western narrative number 2, Russia's invasion was completely unprovoked by the US, NATO, and the West. I've heard this over and over and over again. This is almost like a religious pronunciation to be doctrinally replicated by anchors at CNN, anchors at MSNBC, and anchors at Fox News, which are all sort of surprisingly on board on the Ukraine crisis, except with the kind of weird aspect that Fox has these weird things it does where everything's about how we got to dig up more fossil fuels. They're spinning everything around fossil fuels. But they all say this is completely unprovoked. This is complete nonsense. And I want to return to this in a few minutes in some detail because it's very important to break it down. The other ones that I'm going to mention here now can be just dealt with right away. And then I want to return to that. False Western narrative number 3, Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. Putin wants to restore the USSR. That's not true. Listen to his speech that he gave on the eve of the invasion. It was anti-Soviet. It was anti-Lenin. It was much more in line with Catherine the Great. It was a part of an older pre-Soviet Russian imperial project. Putin is only admired by idiots on the left. Anybody that's on the left that admires Putin is out of their mind, in my opinion. I'm sorry. He's a hero for some very good reasons, which maybe we can get into in the Q&A, for the fascist right, for the white nationalist right, for the patriarchal strongman wannabe right of the United States and also of Western Europe. And he's an anti-Soviet, he's an anti-communist. There's a reason he's a global hero for fascists all over the world, but not for people on the left, not for socialists. False narrative number 3. Putin wants to, excuse me, I just said that. Oh, I'm sorry, I got confused. False Western narrative number 4 is this whole democracy versus autocracy storyline that is repeated again and again and again and again by the talking heads in the political class and the media class. Zelensky and Ukraine are supposedly great champions of democracy. No, they're agents, they're embodiments of bourgeois democracy, which is I always kind of hesitate to use the phrase because it's sort of oxymoronic. Bourgeois democracy is a form and a cloak for capitalist class rule, which is not democracy. We have bourgeois democracy here in the US, where majority and generally progressive public opinion is consistently canceled by concentrated wealth and power on issue after issue after issue after issue. And of course, we don't just have any kind of normal bourgeois democracy. We have a very strange and curious form of bourgeois democracy wedded to a slave owner's charter that was written and passed in the time of Louis XVI in the late 18th century. False Western narrative number 5. Sanctions on ordinary people lead them to rise up in rebellion against their dictator. And by the way, if you don't think Putin's a dictator, just look at how he's responded to the aftermath of his invasion, all the people he's locking up. So he is a dictator. Got a problem with that on the left, you got a problem. He's a dictator. But sanctions do not have a very good historical record when it comes to turning people against regimes. That is not how it worked in Iraq at all. In fact, if anything, they give dictators a kind of distractive, deflective ability to blame external forces for the misery people are experiencing on them. I know Noam Chomsky argued repeatedly that the sanctions in Iraq deepened the power of Saddam Hussein there. If people thought economic sanctions on Iran were going to lead the people to overthrow the mullahs and the theocratic powers there, that has not been borne out. So it works the other way. Granted, we don't know, because these are absolutely remarkable sanctions. It's very important to keep in mind that it's almost as if people think here, and certainly the talking heads on CNBC seem to act like this, like sanctions are this benign, peaceful, non-violent response to imperial aggression. People die from sanctions, okay? They can't get medicine. They're knocked out of employment, and they can't buy basic food necessities anymore. Tens of thousands have died from sanctions in Iraq, in Iran, and elsewhere. It's huge. It involves huge human suffering for ordinary, common, working class, lower class, middle class people who have not been consulted on things like Saddam's decision to invade Kuwait, or like Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. I went off a little bit about that. False Western narrative number 6. Putin wants to march into NATO territory, starting with Poland. He has no interest in negotiations. There's no off-ramps for Putin. It's not just about Ukraine, it's a war on all of Europe and indeed all of civilization. So we must pull out all the stops and fight Putin to the last drop of blood, come hell or high water. I can't tell you how many people I've seen say this, or words to this effect, on the cable news channels. And of course, with this kind of warmongering sentiment being deeply reinforced by not made up, but very real, and therefore all the more potent images of devastating criminal assaults on real people in Ukraine. But this notion that Putin wants to just go all the way, that he's not going to stop, he's going to go into NATO territory, is highly dubious. It's a very dubious narrative. Putin has had a very difficult time subduing just Ukraine. He appears to have underestimated the task, contrary to Donald Trump's early description of Putin as a genius who really made a really smart move. He's having all kinds of resource issues. There appear to have been significant strategic mistakes leading to the firing of some of his generals. He's having huge morale issues among his troops and in his own populace, which is facing an imploding economy due to historically unprecedented sanctions. Maybe that just sounds like I'm pro-sanctions, sorry. NATO is consolidating like no time in recent memory in the wake of the Ukraine invasion. I don't think Putin wanted that. Finland and Sweden are talking about joining NATO. So historically, epically, monumentally neutral Switzerland signed on with economic and financially significant Switzerland signed on with the sanctions. Images of civilian destruction are making Putin in at least in part of the world, certainly in the West, into more of a pariah than he'd ever been before. He's being portrayed as something like an evil, dastardly, sinister criminal in a James Bond movie. It's kind of a disaster for him in some ways, arguably. But in any event, the idea that he has the ability or the desire to push beyond Ukraine, to me, seems far-fetched. I think he knows it would mean mushroom clouds over Moscow. Second problem here is that Russia has, in fact, sent out feelers and terms for the cessation of hostilities. Russia has made, there are terms for the cessation of hostilities. You know, how serious they really are, well, I guess we'll find out. Basically, neutrality for Ukraine, which is an understandable thing for them to want. I'll get into that in a second. Plus the recognition of the fait accompli of Russia's annexation of Crimea, and plus independence for two breakaway Russian-speaking provinces in the eastern part of Ukraine. These things are negotiable. This is complex. We can talk about it more perhaps in the Q&A, but it's increasingly likely that Trump, that's interesting, that's a Freudian slip, that Putin needs and wants some kind of off-ramp to end this thing. False narrative number 7, a no-fly zone in jet planes would save lives. At the risk of being simplistic, here's the problem with that. There's 40 million people or so left in Ukraine right now, and there's 8 billion people still stuck on Earth who haven't found another planet to relocate to in case of World War III. And at the risk of sounding crassly humanitarian, I'm not ready to sacrifice 8 billion people and the future of the species for 40 million people. And of course, if we did graduate to World War III, as we could, the Ukrainian 40 million would be lost as well. Obviously, they'd be among the first incinerated in a war. Run away from anybody like Zelensky who tells you Putin is just, quote unquote, bluffing about nuclear war. Do you really want to test that hypothesis? Is that something we want to do we want to run that experiment? We've been lucky as hell to have avoided World War III as long as we have with all the nuclear weapons in the world. That's not a game to be played. Oh, he's bluffing. Let's give this maniac, and I think he might be a bit of a maniac, some kind of off-ramp before this nightmare goes nuclear. Some folks say, don't get all excited about this no-fly zone. These calls for no-fly, which are coupled with these very real, horrible images out of Ukraine. These calls for no-fly are nothing to worry about because Biden and the American Secretary of State of Blinken have said again and again, we're not going to do no-fly zone. And like Biden has even, bent down into his microphone and said, that would be World War III. I kind of like Joe when he does stuff like that. And they shot him down, so we don't have to worry about it because our elite knows it. I am not going, I'm not there. I'm not where it doesn't matter because they get it. I think I disagree. There's 74% support for a no-fly zone in the United States right now because of all these horrible images coming out of Ukraine. We have a very weak president. Biden is not a strong president. He has epically low approval numbers. It's an election year. There's these constant images of horror, and they're real, on cable news. There's a cult that's been built up around Zelensky. It's just absolutely extraordinary. This is a practically messianic character now. And he's calling for a no-fly zone. In any event, public opinion for no-fly is being created every day on TV and on the line. I'm going to point at the Loop right now. I'm literally pointing downtown Loop. We had like thousands of Ukrainian Americans and pro-Ukrainian people chanting in the Loop, close the sky, close the sky. And I think about that slogan. I'm like, close the sky? Think about that. Yeah, we'll close the sky with World War III. Here's my 8th false narrative. And yes, Jay, I am keeping an eye on the time here. I'm going to mention this last false narrative, and then I'm going to get a little bit more into this really key matter of how the US and NATO provoked this invasion and then I think I'll probably wrap up this false narrative. 8, the US cares deeply about Ukrainians. Again and again, there's this bleeding heart, there's this sense of just this deep caring about Ukrainians. Really? Then why is it and its media dismissing all Russian peace offers, thereby prolonging the agony and upping the ante of devastation, making it possible that the crimes there could start to match the ones that our allies have committed in Gaza and in Yemen, and that we ourselves have committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm going to be very brutally candid about something here. US policy isn't about helping Ukrainians. It's about US imperial strategic aims. And right now, what's shaping up appears to be a campaign to bleed Russia in a prolonged war that will kill thousands, if not tens of thousands more Ukrainians. There's no particular deep concern about that in elite Washington policymaking circles. I am afraid, I hate to break it to folks, the real concerns are very, very different. Now, let me get back to that all-important second narrative, the claim that Putin's invasion is unprovoked. Don't get me wrong, Putin did not have to invade. His invasion is a crime. It is an epic war crime. However, the notion that it's completely unprovoked really, really has to be resisted. It's really false. It's kind of when I think about how ghetto violence is reported on the 10 o'clock news in Chicago and every other major city. There's no excuse for people pulling out guns and shooting each other in the west side of Chicago or south side of Chicago. No, there's no, it's a horrible, inner city, urban crime anywhere is crime. Crime is crime. But if you know the conditions on the west side of Chicago, you know the conditions on the south side of Chicago, or the east side of Detroit, or the north side of Milwaukee, or the north side of St. Louis, there's nothing surprising about it. And because of the conditions. And if you want to end the violence, you need to look at the conditions that give rise to it. It's true in foreign policy too. There's two key points here. One, the US ruling class had a debate and made a decision after the fall of the Soviet Union. They decided this is in the 90s, to reject and abandon promises made to Mikhail Gorbachev and Russia as the terms to follow in the wake of the dismantling of the Soviet Empire. Instead of incorporation into a common Europe, combined with demilitarization and the provision of large-scale economic and social assistance to help Russia transition into a post-Cold War European order, the US ruling class in the 1990s decided to continue treating Russia as a hostile power. America imposed harsh neoliberal economic punishment on Russia, leading to, among other things, a drastic decrease in Russian life expectancy, an epic collapse of Russian living standards. Washington pushed its military alliance right up to Russia's western doorstep in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. Total military and economic humiliation, worsened by lying at the beginning of the process that we wouldn't do that to you. And that humiliation and that deception created the vengeful, fascistic, authoritarian, white Orthodox nationalist Vladimir Putin and his power within Russia and his initial considerable popularity in that country. Second point, Ukraine is a special case. Ukraine ain't Latvia. Ukraine ain't Lithuania. Ukraine is the second biggest country in Europe. Ukraine is of epic historical, cultural, spiritual, ideological, and material significance to Russia historically and to the Russian Empire. There's an ideological component to that. There's a cultural component to that. There's also a strategic and economic component to it. Ukrainian grain Ukrainian minerals, Ukrainian seaports, and just the vast expanse of Ukrainian land, which goes right into the underbelly of Russia, and in fact expands east of Moscow. And yes, there has in fact been lots of Western and NATO interference in Ukraine. But all that significance that I just outlined about Ukraine is really why there's always been a red line around Ukraine. And there's been a lot of Western and NATO interference in Ukraine. In a 2008 NATO agreement called the Bucharest Agreement, it was stated flat out that NATO seeks ultimately the participation of Ukraine in NATO. In 2014, the United States and the West were politically intervened in Ukraine to overthrow a neutral, somewhat pro-Russian elected government there and replace it with a Western-facing, pro-Western capitalist government. The coup was conducted with fascist paramilitaries in part that were later integrated under US pressure into the Ukrainian National Guard. There have been numerous joint military exercises with the Ukrainian forces conducted by NATO. There have been NATO ships quite recently in the Black Sea. The European Union has funded to the Ukrainian military to the tune of millions of dollars. And now we appear to be in a situation where NATO, which is really the United States, is trying to bleed Russia to death and to give Russia its second Vietnam, the first one being the war in Afghanistan that helped topple the USSR. And now we have the new Western imposed Vietnam in Ukraine that is meant to topple Putin. How long would it take the US to bomb and reinvade Mexico if Mexico was aligning itself or threatening to align itself or seeming to align itself with a Russian and or Chinese military and economic alliance that had already aligned with numerous other Latin American countries and Canadian provinces? So it's the West is not innocent by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think there's any one particular moment right prior to the Russian invasion that explains this crisis to the same extent that the discovery of missiles in Cuba provoked the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, the Cuban missile, the missiles were brought to Cuba in '62 in the wake of the US actually invading Cuba. I mean, actually trying to invade Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The timing is interesting. It's an interesting kind of thing, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about why Putin decided to invade when he did. I do think it was fundamentally provoked over years. I suspect that he made some calculations about Western divisions, made some calculations about energy prices, made some calculations about inflation, made some calculations about the weakness of Biden. He clearly waited until his erstwhile ally China's Olympics were over. There's a number of things that came together and overdetermined why he picked the moment that he did. To say that NATO and the United States provoked the Russian invasion is not just a left position. Noam Chomsky says it, I say it, Refuse Fascism says it, left-wing DSAers I know say it, at least the more left-oriented DSAers I know say it, Revolutionary Communist Party says it. I'm sure a whole bunch of Trotskyists say it. I'm sure a lot of people who call themselves Marxists say it. So it's a left position, but it's not only a left position. George Kennan, the architect of the original Cold War, said don't expand NATO up to the doorstep of Russia, and certainly don't include Ukraine unless you want big trouble. Quote unquote, don't poke the bear. William Burns, the current CIA director, when he was Russian ambassador between 2000 and 2005, warned about excessive NATO expansion and messing with Ukraine. I found on Twitter a statement from Joe Biden. Joe Biden, in 1997 talking to some policy forum in DC saying, don't mess with Ukraine. That's too far. That's a red line too far. That would freak out Russia, and for some very good reasons. Academics who are not leftists, like Andrew Basovich and John Mearsheimer, talk about the recklessness and the provocative nature of endless NATO expansion, and particularly NATO expansion in the red line, hyper strategic, super significant province of Ukraine. So it's not an apology for Putin to bring all this up. I'm going to wrap up really quickly. What we want, real simple: peace, end of the war, peace now, before this thing spills over and goes nuclear. The campist, Pavlov, fake left seems to want Putin victory. They think that's an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist victory. That's idiotic. The social democratic sort of center left seems to want a Zelensky Ukraine victory, doesn't seem to understand or care that that is impossible without massive US imperial support and a rising mass of dead Ukrainians martyred for the US NATO cause of bleeding Russia. No, we're not picking sides, at least I'm not. I'm not looking for a winner here. End this war so we can breathe again and live on to make the only war that matters, the people's war against capitalism, imperialism. The masses of the world have no country. I support internationalist and socialist rebellion, uprisings, even revolution against capitalism, imperialism in every nation and region of the world. Fight the rich, not their wars, or maybe more accurately, fight your dominant social and political order, not your social and political orders wars. The other night, I really am wrapping up on MSNBC, I saw a former high diplomat in the Obama administration say that, quote, I wrote it down, now is the time to choose sides. And of course, he meant, with democracy against autocracy. And I thought to myself, yes, comrade, now is the time to side with peace and justice and ecology-loving people of the world against the profit, war, and ecocide pigs of Washington, of Moscow, of London, of Brussels, Paris, Ankara, Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and Brasilia. And also against any and all people calling, even if they're a comedian turned Western Messiah cult hero named Zelensky, also against any and all people calling for US and NATO no-fly zones and jet planes over Ukraine. So we'll go to Q&A. Someone asked me about the energy and ecological aspects of this. It's very, very interesting. To conclude, in the words of Chicago's Fred Hampton, all power to the people.
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. We have a number of questions that people have put in the Q&A, and I see some good comments in the chat. If you specifically, it's helpful if you write your question or a comment that you want Paul to respond to in the question segment. Several of these have to do with, not surprisingly, fascism. One attendee wrote, I view Trump as part of a worldwide trend. Orban, Modi, even Xi in China, and so on, just like the fascist tendencies in the World War II era, even Roosevelt, imprisonment of Japanese Americans, etc. Leaders taking dictatorial or strong leadership and control. That's not a question per se, but a comment. And Lee Lightfoot says, thank you, Paul, excellent analysis. But so that's the worldwide trend of dictatorial leaders. And Lisa writes, please elaborate on false Nazi narratives. Not sure, I mean, that could be the Nazi narratives of the Nazis in Ukraine. If you wanted to specify that more, what you mean, Lisa, that would be great too. So you want to take one of those or both of those on?
Yeah, well,
Worldwide,
there is a trend, there is an authoritarian trend globally. There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. China seems to have gotten away with the suppression of Hong Kong, and that's faded out of the news cycle, and that's just kind of a done thing. I remember a bit of a kerfuffle over Myanmar, and we don't hear about that much anymore. That seems to have been consolidated. We certainly aren't seeing here the kinds of things that are happening in Putin's Russia right now, which are just absolutely extraordinary. 15 years, 15 years for two journalists who dare to call the Russian war of invasion either a war and an invasion. People courageously coming out on the streets to protest, being instantly swept up. All independent media has been shut down. Social media is going away. I'm not a big fan of social media, but fact is people do get a lot of alternative information that they might not get otherwise that way. And, you know, you could, you sort of go on. Now, you talk about the problem of fascism, and I'm forgetting who asked this question. Your main responsibility for us is to counter the fascism in our own country. That's what Refuse Fascism is all about. And that danger is very real and has not gone away just because Joe Biden is in the White House. And in fact, it seems to be gathering steam. It's alive and well on numerous levels. The drifts towards voter suppression, and in fact, even worse, voter and election cancellation in dozens of red states around this country. The passing of laws that are to criminalize the teaching of accurate history and sociology about problems of race and gender in this country. The frontal assault right now, I think sort of the vanguard or the front of the spear of the fascist Christian right-wing assault right now is the attack on the basic women's human right, reproductive rights. So, we're not going to fly over to Russia and undo Putin fascism. We've got our hands full with that right here in this country. You know, on the false narrative about not Nazism, there are Nazis, there are fascists in the Ukrainian political system, and particularly in the military. There's no doubt about it. That does not mean that Ukraine, as I've seen Pavlovian, campist, Putinist, online leftists just say over and over again, Ukraine's a Nazi state. It's just preposterous. A Nazi state. It's a fledgling bourgeois democracy. Zelensky, after all, is Jewish. It's kind of tough for a Nazi state to have a Jewish guy as their president. It's corrupt. It's trying to counter some of that corruption with a measure of elementary basic constitutional democracy. The whole government itself is not a fascist state. On the Russian side, there's a reason Putin is a hero for the fascist right across the West. There's a reason for it. His leading intellectual authority, sort of his Steve Bannon or his Stephen Miller, is Alexander Dugin. And Alexander Dugin is an Orthodox Russian theorist of palingetic, vengeful, chosen people, racialized, Orthodox Christian white nationalism and arch authoritarianism, who is trying to make Russia great again. It's all about making Russia great again. And you couple that with the blatant open crackdown on civil liberties. You couple that with the cult of personality around the always male, repressive, authoritarian, militarized leader, the legitimization of violence, the squelching of constitutional rule of law. Putin, in many ways, is sort of textbook fascist. People who are like lining up with Putin against Ukraine in the name of anti-fascism are showing that they have a lot of confusion about the meaning and the reality of what fascism is. But yes, there's fascism in Ukrainian society. There's fascists in the U.S. in Ukrainian military. There are fascists in the United States of America. We had a fascist president for 4 years. He was a sloppy, instinctive, more than doctrinal fascist, but he's a very real fascist. Anyone who doubts that should get my book. This happened here. I detailed 18,000 different ways in which Trump was a fascist. He had fascists like Stephen Miller and Stephen Bannon and Michael Flynn advising him. He legitimized violence. He assaulted constitutional rule of law. The notion that there was even a debate about whether Trump was a fascist should have just absolutely disappeared on January 6th of 2021, where he crossed that full-on red line of deploying military, sort of semi-paramilitary violent mobs and thugs in the streets to do what? To overthrow bourgeois democracy, to overthrow a bourgeois election. Massive lawlessness in the name of law and order. Classic calling card of fascism. So there you go. Yeah.
There's another question that follows up on what you're just talking about. John asks, I was wondering if you could speak to what appears to be splits among the American fascists regarding this situation. It seems that some of the fascists are siding with Putin, at least tacitly. Others are siding with Ukraine, NATO. How do you read that situation?
Yeah, I've been observing that too, and I think there are very real divisions within the Republican Fascist Party, and it's pretty well known that not just Kinzinger and Lynn Cheney, who are a tiny minority within the Republican Party, who are very strongly committed to constitutional rule of law and electoral democracy. Well, I probably shouldn't say that, but certainly constitutional rule of law. And no, Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell famously has contempt for Trump. Obviously Mitt Romney's got a lot of problems with Trump. There are some high-level Republicans in the Senate and elsewhere, places like the American Enterprise Institute and so forth, that have real issues with him. I think the problem that we don't know, and it's very interesting to see how the Ukraine crisis will impact this, is the extent to which Trump's grip on his base, which is his lever, which ultimately, at the end of the day, keeps even Republicans who are uncomfortable with him sort of on board. I mean, it's very strange. You see Pence sort of starting to, in the last few months, starting to come a little bit out of the comfort, out of the past comfort zone, and say at least say that Trump was wrong on January 6th. I said William Barr, his Attorney General, has a new book out right now that's critical of what he calls the childish and impetuous, unprofessional nature of Trump. But when they ask these guys, would you still support him in 2024 against the Democrats, they still say that's just horrible, ridiculous bullshit in which they're doing the classist fascist thing of conflating the Democratic Party with socialism, calling them all progressives. And then, of course, progressivism means leftism and all of that. And it's still going to line up with them. Whether this thing, which is so grotesque, what Russia is doing and exposes Trump as kind of a yet again. I mean, the problem is I've seen Trump exposed as a horrible, awful, disgusting, a miserable human being like 5,000 times, and he just sort of seems to keep coming back. But his early embrace of this and calling Putin a genius, when it turns out it might actually be something of a fiasco for Putin, could be part of a fracturing of that, and maybe could provide some cover for the Justice Department to go through with an actual prosecution of Trump. But I've learned again and again I'll believe it when I see it. He still has a hold on his base. Yeah, still has a hold on his base.
A question that follows right up on that from Lou. Paul, what do you mean when you say imperialism is what's driving both the US and Russia and US aims, and compared to the view that sees the problems as simply Putin, like Hitler or Trump, as out of control madmen. Certainly something we hear, just what you were saying, exposed yet again.
Ukraine is a very resource rich. The minerals, the grains, the ports are of great material, economic, as well as military and strategic significance. I think Putin is sincere. I don't think he's just playing around when he cites the desire to restore Russian national greatness. It's not about the Soviet Union. He's not trying to restore the Soviet Union. He's trying to restore the Russian Empire identified with Catherine the Great, the stuff that Alexander Dugin talks about. If you listen to someone like Jason Stanley, it almost seems to be just about the wonderful Yale philosopher that we've allied with in many previous occasions. It almost seems to be just sort of ideological and spiritual kind of connection, but it's also historically and to this day a material and economic connections. Oligarchs in Russia that want access to all those goodies. They want to make money. Russia became a capitalist country in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They have capitalist interests. Putin is connected to oligarchs who want to buy up materials. There is a conflict on the American side, and there's a conflict between the United States and Russia over who's going to supply liquid natural gas to the Europeans. One of the things that this whole crisis does is shut off Western European access to Russian oil and to Russian gas. And now there's this has been the American petroleum and fossil capital interests are licking their chops to try and fill that gap. If you could get strategically American military, allied military forces into NATO, into the very deep underlying heart and underbelly of Russia, and have a sort of model of pseudo bourgeois democracy, NATO equipped, US equipped, buying US military equipment in there, that could become an instrument of the long sought and never dropped dream of collapsing the Russian regime altogether, which I do think is a goal, is a drive in the West, and always has been. They just have this problem that Putin seems to have as many nuclear weapons as NATO does, the United States does. And what we want is the working people and the common people and the basic masses of all these countries to rise up against their war masters.
Now, the next question kind of overlaps what you've been speaking to about do you believe that elite and oligarchic collusion with a fascist party is a necessary condition for a fascist, the term used is revolution, say a fascist coming to power? That could be answered in terms of the United States. But the question is put in general terms.
It's not a prerequisite for a fascist movement. I think we had a fascist movement. I think we have a fascist movement in the United States. It did have critical alliances with key parts of the American capitalist class, particularly in fossil fuels and some military contracting and a lot of smaller and medium-sized businesses. You don't have a fully consolidated fascist regime until you have buy-in from the capitalist elite, which could be even passive buy-in. That was always one of my concerns about a second Trump term. There was incredible silence from within the corporate elite for 4 years of a fascist in the American White House. There's incredibly little altogether said about that. Obviously, most of the money had gone the other way, had gone with Clinton, went with Biden, but there was a lot of reluctance to actually say anything about it until like 99% of the way through, and after and after January 6th, and then all of a sudden you saw the social media companies cutting off, and you saw a lot of leading corporate actors sort of come out of their cowardice and say some strident and significant criticisms of him. If he had won, I'm quite sure that most of the business elite would have gladly accommodated with him and thoroughly enjoyed further tax cuts and deregulations and other kinds of things that Trump was always very careful about giving the business elite. I don't think they would have any problem with that at all, to be perfectly honest.
Well, let me follow up on that.
I'm not sure that's an answer to the question, though. Yeah.
Well, you've written a lot about people on the left or with a history on the left who insisted that Trump was not a fascist because in their view, in Europe of the 1930s, fascist movement was required because you had a revolutionary working class and you had the threat of revolution, and you don't have that in the US. So therefore, there's no reason for fascism in the US. And you've argued that no, there are lots of irresolvable problems that the ruling elites in this country have faced. For instance, ecocide, ecology, the devastation of the environment that capitalism can't stop destroying. That is an irresolvable conflict. Just what we've been talking about, the competition among empires that have gotten is intensified with all of these, that there are underlying material problems, contradictions in the Marxist, that the fascists step up. And then within the United States, you have the refusal of African Americans to accept white supremacy, women to accept patriarchy, that fascism proposes the resolution.
I guess that's what that question was about, wasn't it? Well, you know, I sort of read it as being very much about a consolidated regime. One of there were two things relevant to all of that I found in all the fascism denial, which was just ubiquitous in the liberal and left intellectual classes during Trump. One of them was thinking that when we were talking about fascism as a problem, or fascism in the White House, that people had no business talking about fascism unless and until there's fully consolidated classic Coke fascism on the model of Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. If it's not fully consolidated, where in fact we were talking about fascist politics and a fascist political playbook and a partial fascist presence and a rather key part of government in the world, the executive branch, the most powerful country in the world. But secondarily or collaterally or related to that, there was an over focus in understanding the politics of fascism and understanding fascism on this merger of corporate interests, financial interests on one hand, and the government on the other hand, in this just ridiculous underestimation of the racial and the ethnic and the gender aspects of fascism, the core ideological, heavily racialized nationalist components of a fascist base and of a fascist politics. It was as if people who were into extreme fascism denial had never read Mein Kampf or never read Hitler's speeches and never seen how fundamentally foundational and critical to fascist ideology this highly racialized and vengeful, defensive, quote unquote, palingenetic nationalism was. And that was a problem. Now, one of the great European scholars of fascism, Roger Griffin, claimed that fascism was now just sort of a throwback and not going to happen in the West anymore because it could only have emerged from an extreme existential crisis in the wake of World War I, the mass upheaval of population, and the Great Depression. Oh, I see, that went away. and the Great Depression and this great threat from the left. But now a lot of people who study the relationship between ecological crisis and related economic crisis and fascism are finding that the existential breakdowns in Western society that seem to be written into where we are headed ecologically could very, very well set off precisely the kind of challenges or perceived challenges to capitalist power, to white power, to male power. And those challenges don't have to come from an organized, classic Marxian revolutionary proletariat. They could come around race, they could come around gender, they could come around ecology, they could come in connection with a adaptation or a mitigation crisis related to the environmental problems. And that could give rise to a distinctive form of European and American fascism. The 21st century version, late fascism, as it were, will probably lead with race and ethnicity. Though I would also factor in gender. It'll attack workers, make no mistake. But we don't need this organized revolutionary proletariat in order to have fascism. It's a myth. It was a critical part of the classic ingredient that we're talking about. Late neoliberal era, non-classic, another kind of fascism. Fascism changes forms over time and place. And yet it's amazingly consistent across those times and places too. It's kind of an interesting dialectic. You got me going on that. Let's get another question in if we have.
Well, and stepping back just a few inches, what produced that those revolutionary movements of that time? They didn't just come out of thin air. It was exactly those underlying contradictions. And to tie in a couple of things that you just said, talking about the ecological collapse that's already underway in some parts of the world, that is already giving rise to refugee numbers that have not been seen since World War II. And again, that's part of fueling the xenophobia of the fascist movement.
It fuels the narrative of the liberal cosmopolitan elite that is trying to replace the supposedly superior, virtuous, hardworking white people of Poland, of Hungary, of France, of Germany, of the United States, of America. They're trying to replace us. That's absolutely right. But there's something else on that issue of no Marxist revolutionary proletariat. One of the funny things about it now is that if you watch Fox News and if you listen to the right wing, they say it anyway. They're constantly saying that. They're calling everything socialism. They're calling Joe Biden a Marxist. They are feeding the paranoia. Even without a revolutionary socialist movement, you have millions of Americans listening to lunatics like Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Paul Gosar and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity believing that there is one, and a belief becomes a material force in history at a certain point.
Well, and another way of going at this parallel or lack of parallels is how the challenge to put back to people is how out of all of these irresolvable contradictions, all of these crying needs, these crises, whether it's war, seemingly out of nowhere, the possibility, we have a question about that. We want to get back to the no-fly zone and the possibility of World War III, but how out of all that are we challenged to develop a force that can give leadership to all of these people who are in motion, who are going to be in motion, who are going to be striking back. Several people have posted articles from revcom.us, right. And that you go there and that's the challenge that's put to you, right? Is right. Something terrible or something truly emancipating could come out of these horrendous contradictions that are facing not just us, not just Ukrainians, not just Russians, but the people, humanity at this turning point. Let's look at it that way instead of arguing about, is this fascism or not? Let's look at the underlying contradictions driving it all. Right. Some lots of good quotes, some good comments, and
you said there was a question about, I can't remember what, about
yes, one last question in the question and answer section is, can you elaborate on the dangers of no-fly and the potential for World War III?
Well, no-fly is generally speaking, no-fly zones are preparatory to wars. What a no-fly means is actually being prepared to take out both ground installations that are part of the air war and actual jets in the sky. I mean, I think people should just make no mistake whatsoever. A no-fly means a military engagement. It's not some sort of video game here where you just kind of people are sitting in behind computer screens and like FAA, like air traffic control people just say no, Russia don't go in there because they say so, and then pressing a button. It's not a video game. This means F-16s, and what are we up to? I were F-18s. I don't even know. I don't even keep track of this. This means American jets engaging. This means NATO jets, which are American jets, that would be engaging directly with Russian jets. And when they get into firefights with each other and start shooting missiles at each other, they could blow each other up over Ukrainian space, or you can end up chasing each other. A Russian chasing an American, a NATO plane into NATO space, or an American, or in a NATO plane, an American chasing a Russion plane into Russian space, broadening the war, right? Imagine an American plane being shot down, and a guy parachuting and landing somewhere in Russian territory, and then he's a prisoner, and he's on Putin television, and it's just exactly, these are precisely the kinds of scenarios that could lead to that, and there's a loss of history of understanding these dangers that came along with the end of the Cold War. This was kind of part of Cold War life because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and because of the Reagan military buildup and the sort of the second Cold War in the 1980s. There were huge
powers in the U-2 spy plane.
Right, and the United States, and NATO putting missiles in Germany, and the mass demonstrations that there were. And this incredibly aggressive campaign to militarily bankrupt the Soviet Union under Reagan in the 1980s. And there were real nuclear scares. And people seem to think that because the Cold War ended, that mutually assured destruction went away. Well, it didn't. It could have. There was a moment there when the Soviet collapse happened, and there were promises held out, and Gorbachev was dreaming of, and some Western leaders were saying nice things about the possibility of a common Europe and a disarmament of Europe and the tearing down. But we decided to go the other way. Well, we didn't. Our leaders did. Our masters did, and they went with let's humiliate Russia. Let's continue to treat it as an enemy, which is very indicative about what the motivations always were in the Cold War anywhere. They were sold as capitalism versus socialism, when in fact they were in many ways inter-imperial conflicts even before the Berlin Wall came down. So,
well, and I think another outcome of all of the cheerleading, the demands, including mass demands that for close the sky, which I'm here and many of us are here in Chicago, where demonstrations with that demand have been quite large and taken up by the mass media, is that it poses as if the US is somehow standing aside at this point, when the US and NATO are arming Ukraine massively.
Absolutely. Oh yeah.
As just tying together what you were talking about in your talk and this question of the other side of the coin is like, oh, we're not doing enough. We're not doing, as if Biden is Chamberlain, and this is Munich, and he really has to learn the lessons and go after them. That
right. Yeah.
It's covering up the very active role of the U.S.
This narrative that we're not doing anything, I mean, these are absolutely unprecedented levels of historically unprecedented economic sanctions that are potentially cratering a semi-peripheral, semi-modern nation's economy. These are sanctions on a scale that we may have really never seen, and we're in the massive influx of Stinger missiles and other military hardware, serious discussions about bringing in NATO jets. This notion that nothing is being done is just preposterous. It's utterly preposterous.
Right, and then as you put it, as you were describing, Zelensky is, becoming the hero of the day. And when he's the one that's making those demands of close the no-fly zone, and they're being amplified through the mass media in this country and worldwide. It's not only here. There have been large demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations, and I do that with air quotes, in Europe that have, some of which have demanded that as well. That ups the ante for the US doing
it. Seems like Zelensky seems like the biggest thing to hit Europe since the craze over Obama in the summer of 2008. There's a lot of interesting sort of parallels. There are parallels between Zelensky and the European Obama lust, which was actually more extreme than the American Obama lust. It's absolutely extraordinary. And also parallels with Lech Walesa, who became this great anti-Russian, anti-Soviet Western hero in the 1980s. But this has been no small matter. I don't know if people here saw the images of Zelensky on screen, and people in European capitals in the tens of thousands, whole city central squares, like something out of Orwell or something, listening to the Messiah from his bunker in somewhere in an undisclosed location in Kiev. He has addressed the British Parliament on telescreen, and I believe he's scheduled to address the U.S. Congress within days, and he will make this no-fly call. He will undoubtedly make this no-fly call again, and it's not something to brush off. I
have to read a comment from Eric. It's tough, quoting you, it's tough for a Nazi state to have a Jewish president, end quote. Hey, the USA had a black president, but we have a lot of racists here.
That's true. No, that's true.
Quite
that's
well
true.
taken, Eric.
On top of which, there's a Judeo-fascist state that commits just simply epic war crimes that Russia has yet to match in Ukraine, called Israel. Okay, so you can have Judeo-fascist states. I don't know if people have ever seen the images of the aftermath of the Israeli bombings of Gaza in 2014. They are extraordinary. In fact, the first time I saw them, I almost wondered if it was a video game. It's just that the scenes of one bombed out building after another are just mind-boggling and soul crushing. And they go far beyond. I mean, it's very difficult to see. I want to resist the tendency to sound like I'm downplaying. It's very important that we do this. We don't want to sound like we're downplaying the pain and the suffering being imposed on the Ukrainian people. But there is a racial double standard. There is just, it is painful to see the depth and the degree and the extent of the concern for these people, not in and of itself, that's good, but when compared with the indifference towards the suffering in Yemen, towards the suffering in Somalia, towards the suffering in Gaza, towards the suffering of
Libya. Libya was
right.
destroyed by NATO bombing.
Absolutely.
Libya was destroyed by NATO bombing.
And it destabilized all of North Africa. And it was particularly a disaster for African-American people who actually, for Black people in Africa who Gaddafi had aligned with. I mean, nobody ever thinks about the human tragedy that's just ongoing with and without war in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or in Sudan and elsewhere. And the problem with all of this is, among the many problems with this, is it's very difficult to be taken seriously as a critic of Russian imperialism, if that's what you want to be, which at one level people should be, when you're turning a blind eye to your own war crimes, right? It's much of the world looks at this and says, excuse us, What are you talking about? You're very upset about this, but you weren't upset at it. What's the quote from the Bible from Matthew? How do you reproach your brother for the speck in his eye? And yet you have Jesus was a carpenter, so he was using wood analogy. So you reproach your brother for the speck in his eye. Why don't you take the plank out of your eye so that you can see clearly, and then you can take the speck out of your brother's eyes. We have planks in our eyes, there was a few things that olive-skinned Mediterranean peasants from Roman times had to say that people who call themselves Christian might want to think a little more deeply about.
Perhaps mythical peasant. Here's an interesting comment. We have no more questions in the question section. So I'm
You're going to turn comments into questions?
Turning comments into questions. The narrative that the US isn't doing enough is straightforward fascist rhetoric. It is the reflexive claim that we are insufficiently masculine to impose our will by force on less deserving nations. The notion of an internal weakness that undermines a powerful national will is boilerplate fascist appeal. I would raise a question about that. I think of World War II and Franklin Roosevelt putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps because that was an internal weakness that was going to undermine our ability to fight the Japanese imperialists. I'm not sure that's fascist alone. Is that not imperialism at war? I don't know.
So it's fascist to say that we're not doing enough.
We're insufficiently masculine to impose our will by force on less deserving may be ironic. This notion of internal weakness undermining a powerful national will is boilerplate fascist appeal.
I think you need more. I think you need more to actually be, actual fascism. But there's a Venn diagram. There's a Venn diagram overlap with the hypermasculinism that's and the patriarchal, forcefulness that's a key part of fascist.
Right. Is it part of it? Yes. Is it exclusive to fascism? Probably not. Here's one more question. What can we do? We need to, and the answer, we need to stand with people all over the world, not our own slave masters. And here we should welcome the defeats of our imperialists suffer because its actions, including military aggression, are unjust. And its defeats can create better conditions for making revolution, which is the only real viable alternative to stop the runaway environmental disaster. That's a good last comment question. What can we do?
There is an incredible deficit of anti-war movement in this country right now, and there has been since I think late in the Bush presidency. It's often said that Obama killed the anti-war movement, but it was fading before. I think we need to take a long, hard look at why that might be. There are some anti-war groups that say very good things about this. Code Pink has been very good. Refuse Fascism is by its nature an anti-war group. The Revolutionary Communist Party and the Revolution Clubs have had a very strong, consistent anti-war line. And they do thread the needle and refuse to take either side of the imperial conflict and advocate people's uprisings against imperialists of all national stripes. There are chapters of DSA that are very good on this. There are chapters of DSA that are very bad on that. There's very few. Maybe I should say there's individuals in DSA that I've met that are very good on this. Unfortunately, there's a lot of social democrats and sort of DSA types who are getting into Zelensky and over-identifying with Zelensky. Some of this is very understandable. I mean, if I was in Ukraine, I could see making Molotov cocktails and trying to defend my neighborhood against the imperialist invaders. That's an armed citizen taking up grassroots opposition to occupation. But the broader narrative that they have seems to delete the fact that the national resistance to succeed is going to require a whole bunch of NATO weapons and a whole bunch of EU money and just a whole bunch of imperialism, and that you're going to get sucked into a long drawn conflict that your sponsors, what their real objective is to bleed Russia and to prolong the conflict in such a way as to defeat the bigger enemy. You're going to be used as a pawn. We want the war to stop right now. And so you end up sort of seeing, even like people call themselves socialists, dismissing any efforts in negotiation and dismissing any peace offerings and buying into this narrative that there are no off-ramps whatsoever. I'm sorry. I think Putin is a little bit of a maniac. He is a power-hungry, authoritarian, strong man. He's got some issues. He's got a hell of a lot of power. Actually, his psychology kind of matters a little bit. It shouldn't. It's insane in the 21st century that this guy's psychology should matter. But at some point, he needs something in the way of an off-ramp. I just can't imagine not giving him something on Crimea, on the republics, on declarations of neutrality. He wants it in the Constitution. He's insisting that Ukraine would have to have a definition of neutrality in the Constitution. That's a hell of a thing to do. Maybe there's negotiation room on some other kind of declaration of neutrality. It's not crazy to want neutrality in Ukraine on his part. That's not insane. That's not maniacal. There have been problems with Napoleon and Hitler and the Kaiser coming through Ukraine and up into Moscow and St. Petersburg and places like that. That's not nuts. He could use some guarantees here and a promise that Ukraine will be like Austria and Finland were during the Cold War and not be aligned states with NATO. It's not crazy to want to insist that Ukraine not be aligned with NATO. Well, even if people in Ukraine want to be in NATO, I don't care. It's still not crazy. Yeah.
I kind of got me on that last one, but speaking of out of control, when we have the Congress here shouting USA, 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 when Biden talks about standing up to Russia, here we have the cheerleaders, including the liberals and the progressives. I think one of the things that we wanted to do this evening, and I hope that people go away better prepared to take on all of these, as you call them, false narratives, especially all of them that line up people in this country to support imperialist war, to support our slave masters, as one comment put it, that we have a lot of work cut out. There is a huge tsunami of national chauvinism and denial of history, denial of the real power relations, the fundamental nature of this war going on right now, being as you buried in the fog of war. And it's our responsibility in the interests of humanity, not thinking like Americans, to really wage that very sharp political and ideological debates with people. And I hope that people, you can copy the chat, take these links, follow Paul on social media, follow Refuse Fascism, look deeply into this. If you're not subscribing to all of those, including Revolution, you really need to, because we've got our work cut out and everybody can do this work. It's really vital. What kind of world are we headed into? Oh God, okay. Yeah, a sick example of just what I'm talking about. Lou writes, progressive anti-Trump hosts on the Gaslight Nation podcast, which probably most of you are aware of. Today, criticize people who say, what about, quote unquote, when they're calling out US wrongs as morally corrupt? As the host said, interestingly, yes, we should criticize US crimes if the US does commit crimes. Right. And Peter says,
If-
watch the RNL show. Thank you. That's Thursday evenings at any time on YouTube. You know, some great.
If the
Right.
US commits crimes. I have seen serious estimates of the body count of the amount of Southeast Asians killed by the United States between 1962 and 1975 as from as high as 3 to 5 million.
Oh, I think 3 million is well within that's the bottom.
The Iraq War killed at least a million, and the sanctions campaigns between 1991 and the Iraq War probably killed a million, if not more, including 500,000 children, so famously sort of dismissed by Madeleine Albright. I did a piece. One of the most widely read pieces I ever did was on Common Dreams a couple of years ago, called "The World Will Not Mourn the Decline of American Hegemony." Maybe it was U.S. hegemony, and that'd be worth googling up if you want a blood-curdling synopsis and highlight reel of the horrors of the American empire in 4,000 words or so. No, you can't beat it. It's really one of the best things I've ever written. And make sure to read the account of the Highway of Death, the 1991 assault on the surrendering, aerial assault on the surrendering Saddam Hussein troops retreating from Kuwait in 1991. I saw James Clapper early in the invasion, the Russian invasion, go on CNN talking to Don Lemon. And, there's this endless parade on CNN and MSNBC of these blood-drenched war masters. It's really extraordinary. Ex-generals, ex-CIA, ex-national intelligence. And Clapper talked about the Russian convoy, which they were just describing as a 17 to 20 mile convoy rolling down towards Kiev. And he actually said, Clapper did, that he was drooling. He was drooling. He used that word, that he was drooling at the thought of American F-16 and A-10 Warhogs descending on that convoy and doing what? What do people think his historical reference point was for that? The Highway of Death, which was a multi-mile long charnel house of epic carnage, corpses frozen in ash in melted trucks. What is this what is this convoy out of Russia? Well, out of Belarus, I guess. Composed of, among other things, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of 18, 19-year-old, 20 poor Russian conscripts, some of whom apparently thought they were being sent off on a training mission and are then being zapped by NATO-funded Ukrainian drones and turned into ash there. In any event, Clapper said he drooled at it, so, you really got to wonder, placing your hands in the future of a strange Lovian character like that, who openly says that he salivates at the thought of slaughtering thousands of young soldiers.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for everyone who who attended, who commented, who asked your questions, shared your links and insights. I hope this is really encouraging all of us to continue, as I said, to continue. Has to be, we have to help break people out of, well, what Bob Avakian has called the great tautological fallacy. That quote from Gaslight Nation is a great example of it. That, well, America is the good guys, so sure they do some bad things, but they're really trying to do good things because they're the good guys. So they make mistakes, but ultimately they're the good guys. We've got to break people out of that fast. And this is this potential, the war that's going on right now, turning this these horrendous bloodletting into some deeper understanding of the real forces and determination to do everything we can to put an end to the system that continuously regenerates and regenerates these kinds of crimes. So thank you all, and we will be seeing you in the streets. Good night. Any final words, Paul, or should we?
Well, I was just listening to you, Jay, there, and I was thinking of Madeleine Albright's quote, America is good. We always do our best. We stand tall and see the farthest.
Oh, you had to end on that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you again. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.